In 1958, the first video game was invented. William Higginbotham that was a physicist who was set to the task of making some type of entertainment for a convention. So what he did was make a tennis game, where the player would just adjust a knob to change the angle of a ball, then click a button to hit it. The ball would then travel to the other player, and they could hit it. This game was called Tennis for Two, and like I said, it was the very first video game ever created. Now skip ahead 14 years. In 1972, a game came out that literally every human would have heard of. Pong. Within 14 years, the graphics didn't change much, but they still did get somewhat better, and controlling was way easier and simpler than Tennis for Two. I shouldn't need to explain what Pong is, since I'm pretty sure everyone knows what it is and how to play it. Now let's skip ahead 13 years to 1985, and you have Super Mario Bros. Now there are rising companies like Atari and Nintendo who only make video games and gaming consoles, and the graphics are now understandable for characters and environment. Then we skip ahead another 12 years to 1997, we have the first Grand Theft Auto game. The gaming industry is now looking much different. The Nintendo 64 just came out in Europe and Australia. There are all these new gaming companies coming out, and the old ones are just getting bigger and bigger. The graphics are now, for the time, insanely good and innovative, and everything is just getting better and better, exponentially. The Dreamcast, PlayStation, Xbox, PlayStation 2, Xbox 360, all these new games are coming out, and now the gaming industry is now one of the biggest industries that rule our world. But think about how much it changed, and how quickly it went from this to this. It's been 50 years now since the first video game was created, and now gaming is nowhere near how it used to be. Now we have tons of different genres and gaming companies, and all this new technology that is making gaming better and better. But the question I have to ask is the gaming industry going into the right direction? A lot of people recently have been asking about what's happening to the gaming industry as it becomes more and more as a cash-grabbing system, which is kind of what's happening. There are quite a few reasons for how this is happening. There are microtransactions, DLC that gets out of control, and the loss of passion in game making. First of all, let's look at the gaming industry and microtransactions. Microtransactions are when while you're playing a game, you could just spend some real money for usually a currency in the game. Microtransactions all started in mobile app games. It's a little bit vague from what exact app started it all, but we do know it was around the era of when gaming started to enter the smartphone industry. For the main part, microtransactions popped up in free-to-play games. These games, often called freemiums, would make up for the game being free by having long wait times to accomplish tasks. Or you could just give them your card information and get it now. This worked amazingly. Before you even knew it, every game that was free was sure to be riddled with in-app purchases. But very quickly, these microtransactions you could avoid and still enjoy the game started to become necessary. Let's look at a very recent and controversial game, Star Wars Battlefront 2, the 2017 release. This game was super controversial because of the insane amount of microtransactions. Here's how the game would work. You would jump into rounds of Battlefront like any other game and do your usual. Kill the enemy team and stuff, and for the people you killed you would get credits that could be spent on either becoming an overpowered hero once a game, or for opening loot crates. Seems pretty harmless, right? Well, here's where it gets bad. You could just buy the credits for the loot boxes or heroes with your actual money, and those loot boxes contain better weapons that do more damage and make the game easier for you, and make you better at the game. This means that the people who spent money on the game they already bought for $60 now also get rewarded with better weapons. But it gets even worse. The bots that decide which server all the players go into is biased. It will match players that haven't spent any money on the game and have cruddy weapons with players who have spent money on the games and have amazing weapons. The whole point of this was to make players who haven't spent money feel jealous and do worse, which would cause them to eventually fold in and pay for microtransactions. This blew up. Tons and tons of people were outraged that a game would practically make it so you have to pay microtransactions just to do good at the game and to have fun. The company that made Battlefront 2, EA, did eventually start fixing the problems and eventually completely got rid of the microtransactions. Since it was so stupid that a game you've already spent $60 on, you would have to spend tons more just to enjoy it. Downloadable content, or also known as DLC, has slowly been turning into a harmless thing to another creation like microtransactions. DLC all started back in the early PC gaming era, when companies started to offer more things you can add to your game for free. It first was appeared in 1997 when a company called Cave Dog started to distribute extra maps and scenarios for their free downloadable game on PC, Total Annihilation. and soon more and more companies did that for different things. You could start downloading different skins for characters or extra storylines, or maybe even a whole new mechanic. But soon, some game companies decided that if you want to get that extra skin, you just had to pay them something like $1 or $2. So it was nothing bad, and still no one was complaining, since you still got the whole game for the price you originally paid, and didn't even need the DLC. It was just if you really wanted. But then, in recent years, a shift began to happen. It mainly originated from the company EA. Yes, once again, they've caused some controversy over this stuff. EA began to take a different approach of DLC. They decided to 1. Increase the price of DLC to the point where it could be as expensive as the game itself, 2. Create tons and tons of these DLCs just for one game, and finally 3. To make the base game extremely empty and barren without any of the DLC. Let's take one of their games, The Sims. The Sims is one of the most successful series of games for both EA and just the gaming industry, with the height of it being The Sims 3. But then, in 2014, a full 4 years after the release of The Sims 3, The Sims 4 came out, and this game blew up. The Sims 4 sold 11.3 million copies worldwide, which beat the previous game by over 1 million copies. But to everyone's surprise, the game was way worse than The Sims 3. The game is barren. You quickly realize after you just play a few hours that there's nothing to do. The game is very boring and plain, and what EA decided to do to fix it is, you guessed it, DLC galore. The game shoves DLC down your throat, just trying to get you to spend up to $30 just to get something like Halloween decorations. Aye, how cool. But unlike Battlefront 2, this never changed. Still to this day, 4 years later, they still make DLC that costs way too much just for a Sims game. It's just flat out outrageous. Now finally, the main reason I believe the gaming industry is going into just a cash-grabbing area is passion. I want you to think about all those old retro games you've heard about, the original ones made back in the 80s and 90s or early 2000s. I believe the main reason those games were such successes and innovators was that because the developers actually cared for it. Let me explain by looking at the film industry. I don't think it's a surprise that the film industry is far from what it used to be too, and now is mainly a cash-grabbing system. I mean, just think about sequels. Sequels used to be a way of continuing a story that you couldn't fit all in the first movie, but sequels have changed. Now sequels are, hey, people really like this movie, let's make another one. And so you get huge companies that's only goal is to spend millions of dollars making something that they think would get them a quick buck. When people make those huge blockbuster movies that end up sucking, but you saw them anyway because in the trailer it had your favorite actor or some crap like that, they're bad since no one really cared about making that movie. No one actually was passionate about the script or the acting or even the story of the characters and the world. They just did it so they can keep a roof over their heads. That is exactly what is slowly happening to the gaming industry. Ever so slowly, more and more companies are caring less and less about the games and are just making these first-person shooter games that they know people will buy since they poured so much money into the graphics or something like that. It happens with so many different games if you just think about it. It seems that soon every company will just be making crappy games with no passion. It seems like the gaming industry is turning more and more into a way just to empty our penniless wallets. But that's still one more thing. There's always at least some people making passionate games, and the biggest genre of that is indie games. Indie games are when a small group of people, it could be as small as just one person, make a video game. A lot of indie games are trash and are broken, but they still matter more than a huge game like Call of Duty or Battlefield. Because the fact that the game even exists, even though it may have been made by just one person, shows that that person really was passionate about making that game. Let's take a very large indie game that came out recently, Cuphead. Cuphead was created by just 2 or 3, depending on how you look at it, people, and yet was able to sell over 1 million copies on just the first few weeks of the game's release. What's so amazing is when you start to look on how the game was made. Cuphead is a classic run-and-gun style game full of boss fights. The game is styled after classic 1930s style of animation. What's so amazing that they actually animated the whole game with pen and paper just like the 1930s. They did everything to make it just like the old animations. Because of the insane amount of workload and the small amount of people, the game took about 7 years to make. That is an insane amount of time of just working on one game. But that's what it makes it so good. The developers poured so much time and effort into the game, and because they actually cared to make it. It wasn't some random project meant to just gain money, it was something they actually hoped and wanted to make. With that, I believe that indie games are our last little pocket of what the gaming industry used to be like. It's like a little time capsule of what people who are just making games not for money, but for the enjoyment of the gaming industry and life. That is why indie games mean so much to gamers in general. They show what the gaming industry was like in its height. In the end, maybe the gaming industry won't turn into a cash-grabbing area. But with more and more companies charging more and more for everything they make, it really seems like that. The only last thing left I have to say is that it doesn't even matter if you're a huge gamer or have never touched a video game in your life. This all still affects you. The gaming industry makes about $81.5 billion every year. This is a huge part of the economy, and so whatever happens to it could affect you no matter what. Now, I'm gonna go back to playing video games and then sleep since it is 1:58 a.m. as I'm recording this.